It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi there, welcome to The Logic of Risk, episode 10. I'm very pleased with the number of listeners, which is not something to take for granted for a podcast like this. I'm preparing some surprises for you, and I ask you to let me know if there are any topics you would like to see covered in this podcast. Are you ready for this new episode? Let's go! Last time, we began talking about subjective probability by looking at the ideas of Bruno de Finetti. We said that, according to de Finetti and many other subjectivists, the probability of a given event is the fair price of the bet that pays €1 if that event occurs, while you lose your wager if it does not. We also mentioned that the concept of fairness is understood as the personal evaluation of the person placing the bet. So, what is fair for me may not be fair for you, and vice versa. An important concept introduced by de Finetti in his definition of probability as a bet is that of coherence. The definition of the fair price, that is, the numerical value of the probability associated with a bet on a given event, is coherent if it does not expose the bettor to a sure loss, and therefore the counterparty to a sure gain, regardless of the outcomes of the events being waged on. In other words, de Finetti excludes the so-called Dutch book. That kind of bet where the prices are set in such a way that the bettor ends up with a net loss no matter what the result is. Simply put, excluding the Dutch book tells us that if, for me, the probability of rain is 0.3, 30 cents, as mentioned last time, then the probability of no rain must be 0.7, meaning I would be willing to enter a bet where I pay 70 cents and receive €1 if it does not rain. In this way, the sum of the probabilities will be 1, as required by those minimal facts we discussed in the third episode. And this extends if I consider several events, like evaluating the chances of an investment. In the same way, I will never consider as fair and therefore valid foundations of probability a negative price or a price exceeding 1. For those of you familiar with financial mathematics, the concept of no arbitrage might start to spin in your head. The definition of probability as a coherent bet allows de Finetti to also provide an alternative definition not tied to gambling through the use of scoring rules, such as Brier score. In a way, it anticipates and expresses in probabilistic terms Nassim Taleb's idea of skin in the game. To avoid outlandish evaluations of probabilities and to ensure their comparability, our estimates must be in line with the consequences we are willing to face with our real choices. And here, the reference to the ideas of Ramsey about the fact that probabilities are observable through choices is natural. However, I won't bore you further on these, also because the definition via scoring rules would require a mathematical formalization that isn't compatible with a podcast. So, what about the classical and the frequentist definition? For de Finetti, these are pseudo-definitions. The classical one is tautological and useless, as it presupposes knowing what equally likely means at the moment we are defining probability itself. In other words, it is the criticism of the circular definition, if you recall. As for the frequentist view, he writes that it is, quote, like the hydra with its 7 heads, always presenting new variants of frequentist definition attempts. As the previous ones are nibbled away, more and more artificial and unhappy versions emerge. And indeed, to get rid of the indeterminacy of frequency, it is replaced with the unattainable limit frequency, which is knowable only after the end of eternity." Unquote. Reading De Finetti is always entertaining, thanks to his use of imagery, his polemical and ironic verve, and the clarity of his thought. In reality, even if from a philosophical point of view De Finetti shuns objectivism, he is the first to say that one should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The use of relative frequencies, for example, if done with discernment, can prove useful to help and guide us in the subjective evaluation of the probabilities of mass random phenomena, just as the propensional idea of contextualization is extremely useful in the case of one-shot events. And if I'm playing dice or roulette, it is perfectly fine to use the classical approach to form a personal idea of the probabilities in question. In the end, if you wish, the subjective view tells us that, as individuals, we define probability, but in doing so we can use all the tools we deem useful, as long as we remember that we are the ones making the choices. When I, Pasquale, enter my probabilistic bet, I do so based on what I know. And if I deem that to be not sufficient, then I gather information, analyze the data, use models, and consult experts in the field. And thanks to all these, and conditionally on it, I then elicit my probability judgment, which is always conditional and conditioned. The verb to elicit is the technical term used when expressing a subjective probability. The estimation of subjective probability, even when based on data observation and relative frequencies, allows me to do things that are simply impossible for a frequentist. For example, assigning a probability to events that have never happened before, but which I consider important to take into account. For a subjectivist, the fact that the relative frequency of a certain type of flood is zero doesn't constrain me from still considering the event possible and assigning it a probability that may be small but not null. I will thus be less likely to fall into the historical bias. Similarly, I will be less prone to model risk if I always leave open the possibility of being wrong, and perhaps I will commit to quantifying it. After all, a subjectivist knows that simply choosing one model over another is purely subjective, so it makes no sense to shroud it in objectivity. Of course, as a subjectivist, I must avoid falling into the fallacy of mental projection, which we briefly considered in episode 3 when discussing James. That is, thinking of myself as infallible and believing that I'm always right, that things are exactly as they appear in my mind. A good subjectivist is skeptical by nature, with skepticism understood in the philosophical sense. As a subjectivist, I am aware of one thing. As reliable as my estimates might be, they are still estimates, not absolute truths. So, there is a degree of randomness in every probability estimate. A subjectivist reasons in terms of probabilities about probabilities. The model I choose to use is the one that probably works best, the one with the best chances of helping me understand the phenomenon under study, but it is not the truth. As much as we like certainties, probability teaches us that there are very few certainties. The idea of probabilities on probabilities then allows us to introduce a particular type of probabilistic subjectivism, emblematically represented by Richard Jeffrey. Paraphrasing the famous mythological and cosmological expression of Indian origin, every turtle stands on another turtle, Jeffrey coins his own every probability stands on another probability, defining what he calls radical probabilism, that is, the belief that nothing can be considered certain or precise, not even the data, anticipating the later elegant works of Viertel. So there is a constant need to update and review our beliefs in an infinite regress of probabilities on probabilities. And these must be done coherently, using an adaptation of Bayes' theorem and the theorem of partitions, according to what Jeffrey calls probabilistic kinematics. Once again, we will understand all of these better by working through examples, and we will have the opportunity to do so quite soon. We will also see how the infinite regress of probabilities on probabilities generates fat tails, following some research Nassim Taleb and I worked upon together. For the more willing, I recommend Richard Jeffrey's Subjective Probability, The Real Thing, from Cambridge University Press. As usual, on thelogicofrisk.com you can find all the bibliographic details. In summary, for a subjectivist, probability is something personal, dependent on us and our interaction with the world. The way we arrive at our estimates may vary for each of us, but in doing so we must be coherent, generating probability values that respect some minimal facts, that allows us to use them practically, to discuss them, and to compare them rationally. Obviously, the best practical approach is to use the state-of-the-art in modeling, to look at the facts, to collect and analyze data, to reason, to update ourselves, to behave as rational and scientific people. But nothing prevents intuition and heuristics from working better in certain situations, such as with single phenomena, as argued by Gerd Gigerenzer. And it is precisely Gigerenzer, the wise man, whom I recommend today. His book, Risk Savvy: How to Make Good Decisions, shows how intuition, heuristics, and the smart use of the right data, not necessarily lots of data in fact, can be fundamental to managing chance and risk. That's it for today, but we will return to many of the concepts expressed very soon. As we will see, especially if approached pragmatically, subjectivism allows us to avoid the pomposity and the obtuseness of those who, having calculated a little number with an unquestionable model learned in their second year in some university, elevate it to an oracle, an immutable and true quantity. But a sound management of risk requires humbleness, as well as the willingness to continuously review one's a priori, to update oneself, and to readjust one's estimates every time new knowledge emerges. Naturally, subjectivism also has its drawbacks. For instance, what do you do when probability estimates for the same event vary greatly from one person to another, and if these individuals are experts whose opinion matter to us? What if we have no idea of a decent a priori? Are there rules to follow? I will sprinkle you some answers in the upcoming episodes. I can't reveal everything right away. Finally, here is the quote. This time we go to the Netherlands in the second half of the 17th century with Christian Huygens, or Huygens, as you would say in Dutch, who, in a letter to Pierre Perrault, writes, quote, I believe that we know nothing for certain, but everything as probable. Unquote. Until the next episode, with logicism and the axiomatic view. Bye everyone, including the seven-headed hydra. Ciao ciao!
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No